Guwahati. I'd like to welcome you to the valedictory session titled Ethnography at the Margins, delivered by Dr. Sarvajyoti Guwahati. Sarvajyoti Guwahati is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology. Before joining Ashoka University, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in an Institute of Technology Guwahati. Sarvajyoti Guwahati has fieldwork experience in Northeast India and the Himalayan region. Her first monograph, Imagined Geographies in the Indo-Tibetan Borderlands, Amsterdam University Press 2020, was based on empirical and historical research on Tawang and West Kamai, two districts in West Arunachal Pradesh, bordering Bhutan and Tibet, which have been the focus of long-drawn boundary conflict between India and China. The book was awarded honorary mention for the James Fisher Book Prize for the first book on the Himalayas by the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies. She has been the recipient of Werner Grant Dissertation Fieldwork Grant, German Academic Exchange Services Award, Charles Wallace India Trust Award, Sir Ratan Tata Fellowship. Sarvajyoti Guwahati's research interests includes the anthropology of state and borders, indigenous politics, anthropology of mobilities, roads, development and infrastructure, conservation, religion and ecology, and institutions and networks. Her current book project focuses on negotiations between Buddhist educational institutions and the Indian state in the context of national borders and geopolitical developments. She has a long-term interest in studying the relation between culture, politics, and ecology, especially in the case of Himalayan animal life, and has published papers on the yak and Himalayan wildlife species in connection with cultural identity and eco-tourism. She is working on a collection of essays that undertakes a conceptual reading of contemporary social problems in Northeast India. Her work adopts an interdisciplinary approach in analysis while remaining grounded in the disciplines of sociology and anthropology. We welcome you, ma'am. I would like to request our faculty coordinator and chair for the session, Dr. Vasundhara Jairat, to the dais. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Guwahati to the dais to deliver the annual address to the Graduate Research Meet 2023, Margins and Peripheries in South Asia.
Alright, thank you everybody for coming. I'd really like to thank the organizers of the Graduate Research Meet for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. It's an absolute delight to be here on this campus. I'm in love with your campus. I would like to thank the faculty convener, Dr. Vasundhara Jairat, and all the faculty of IIT Guwahati who's been so kind and warm, very nice to hear me. We feel so welcome. I'd also like to thank all of you, all the graduate research scholars who come from far and away and also from here for making this such a vibrant experience. I was listening to the roundtable session that just preceded this session, and I saw the deliberations and discussions that took place then. And I am happy to say that I have also tried conceptualization of the margin in this talk, which is called an endnote address. So I actually was joking in the morning that this is like a footnote. Endnote is a footnote, no? So I'm kind of footnoting what has been said so far in this conference. I'm adding on to certain things that might have been left unsaid or needed elaboration. So I just try to do that. And while I rely mostly on ethnographies, because that is my method of research. I'm an anthropologist and sociologist by training. But I think that the insights are interdisciplinary. In fact, I myself have drawn on interdisciplinary insight from different disciplines, geography, cultural studies, and history. History is a very important discipline for anthropologists, for my own work, and I hope that the concepts of margins that I share will help provoke more discussions, and whatever was not said, it could not be covered in the previous session. I know there were many hands which were raised and some people did not get the chance. I hope that they will use this to further deliberate, and it will stop at 5. Okay. So, I begin with a familiar story in the history of sociology and anthropology in India. Louis Dumont, author of Homo hierarchicus, was influenced by French structuralism and believed that each society is based on an ideational system. So he was led to ask, what is the underlying principle that characterizes Indian society and gives its rationale? He argued that Indian society is based on the fundamental opposition between purity and pollution, which determines the organization of social groups into a hierarchy that we know as caste. This is a very familiar story. I'm just recounting it for a purpose, to make a point. Dumont's many critics, such as Gerald Berman, Andre Bete, Pauline Polenda, T.N. Madan, Mekin Marriott, argued that Dumont was more concerned in model building using textual sources rather than in the indigenous categories that could be gathered from field studies. Since the texts he used were mainly classical Sanskrit texts, they gave an erroneous Brahminical slant to his thesis. If we were to look at caste from below, that is from the margins, the picture is completely different. Joan Venture showed how those placed outside or at the margins of caste hierarchy never accepted the typology and the ideology of the upper caste, and far from caste being a universal moral order, it was contested. And it was only the division of lower castes into classes that prevented them from uniting in revolt. I begin with this vignette to underscore first that margins need not only be borders or remote peripheries. My work has mostly been on metaphysical borderlands, but then I use, we can talk about the difference between borders and borderlands and margins and go on, but margins I feel is a more fruitful concept because it is it can be expanded into many different directions. So second, margins are not inert. So I want to use this talk to open up the conceptual richness of margins and to show how empirical studies can recover their agency and resistive capacity. What are margins? In their book, Anthropology in the Margins of the State, Veena Das and Deborah Poole speak about a view from the margins, especially with regard to the state. They give 3 concepts of the margins. So what I'm going to do is use this conceptualization, this conceptual framework to also provide some more examples from other empirical works, from other ethnographic works. So the first concept of the margin, where margins form natural containers for people considered insufficiently socialized into the law, that is unruly subjects. These are the indigenous people who are both foundational to particular national identities and excluded from the same identities by the sorts of disciplinary knowledge that mark them as racially and civilizationally other. That means the nation requires them as its necessary other for its own self-constitution, but also excludes them. For example, I'm taking the example of another text produced on a different and from a different part of Asia, the Meratus diet of Kalimantan, Indonesia, again by an anthropologist called Anna Singh. Sorry, I actually pronounced Sa as in the Tibetan way, so it comes naturally. Anna Singh writes, marginals stand outside the state by tying themselves to it. As culturally different subjects, they can never be citizens. As culturally different subjects, so the emphasis is different, right, in these different phrases. As culturally different subjects, they can never escape citizenship. So they're different, culturally different. So they can never be full citizens. But yet, because they're part of the national territory, they're subjects, they can never escape negotiating for and as citizens. So by classifying certain peoples as backward and primitive, modern states justify their continued domination and intervention into the lives of the so-called primitives. Margin, in this sense, could mean geographical spaces where such internal others reside. Indigenous habitats, borderlands, disturbed areas, or hills which escape civilization, like James called Zomia. And I think, wherever I go, people talk about Zomia so much that I assume that most of you know Zomia, but we can talk about it in case, you want to talk more about what is Zomia. Zomia, I'll not go into it now, but it's basically, it's a kind of political stance of resistance which is adapted by the hill population according to a theory given by William Van Schenkel and adapted by James Scott. But margins are not always far from the civilization or the center. They could be right at the center and yet disconnected, where the welfare aspect of the state is totally missing. So examples of such marginal settlements include city spaces which have grown as a result of contested social relations, such as Juhapura in Ahmedabad, said to be the largest Muslim settlement in India with almost 4 lakh residents. It is a sub-city within a city, created by the series of communal riots in Ahmedabad, which led to Muslim residents vacating Hindu spaces and vice versa. Again, a lot of historical and anthropological work has taken place on this. City margins also include those that get left out from urban design. There's a famous sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman who had said that there is nothing intrinsic to waste. Whatever we consider waste is not because of some inherent property. It's only because they don't fit into some kind of a design. So if you think of a chair, chairs, the shavings, the wood shavings that get left out, there's nothing wrong with those. It's just that they get left out during the carving process. So the Bhalswa landfill near Delhi Haryana border, where the city's waste has been dumped daily since 1984. And this is a site I encounter almost daily because it is on the way to my university. I actually stay inside JNU campus in Delhi, and I commute to my workplace in Ashoka University, which is like a 2.5 hour commute. And this landfill is like a kind of a big landmark. And often, sometimes when unknown, unwary friends and relatives come, it's such a huge mound. We joke that this is part of the Aravalli ranges, and some gullible people like my niece believed it. So, populated today mostly by Bengali Muslim migrants from West Bengal, Bhalswa residents. Some of you know it as Jahangirpuri landfill. They inhale the toxic gases from the dump, drink the water contaminated by waste, face threats to their lungs and reproductive health, and still they continue their day-to-day living as rat pickers in the waste economy. The second way we can conceptualize margins, so we've talked about one way, where margins arise from the blurring of the legible and the illegible. The modern state we all know is called the documentary state, right? It has rested on legibility. Very famously, James Scott's Seeing Like a State makes this point, and it has been explored by many others. For example, Matthew Hull, who's written an ethnography on Pakistan, he says that documents have generative capacity because whatever is documented becomes the reality. You want to sell your house and you ask or land, and you ask the land record keeper to say that you have 30 betel nut trees in the report, and if that 30 betel nut trees get written down, that means your land has 30 betel nut trees, whether in actuality that those 30 trees are there or not. So documents are generative capacity, and states rely on such documentary processes to make populations legible to itself. Censors, gazetteers, administrative reports, a lot of historical and ethnographic and empirical work and rich work has been done on the documentary state. Basically tries to rely on these statistics, this codification, in order to know the population and the territories over which it wants to administer or extend its rule, right? Yet, despite this character, this documentary character, the state is continually undone by the illegibility of its practices. What kinds of illegibility practices? Displacement, falsification, and false circulation of personal identity papers. I am drawing on my own ethnographic work here as the example. So I worked in the Tawang and West Phameng districts for main part of my fieldwork has been there in the western part of Arunachal Pradesh, and this region has a very interesting political, social, cultural history. It was administered. It was it paid taxes to the Tibetan tax for many centuries, 3 centuries. In 1914, the Indo-Tibetan boundary was demarcated by colonial rulers. They never tried to extend their enforce their boundary because of great game politics, geopolitical factors. For a long time, India became independent. Boundary war happened, and then in 1959, when the Dalai Lama came with Tibetans to India, a lot of Tibetans also came with him, but that doesn't mean that there were no Tibetans before the Dalai Lama's exile and a lot of other Tibetans following him. There were Tibetans who had already been living cross-border lives and had been living in that area for a long time before 1950. So anyway, what happens here is that the local Arunachal Pradesh Students' Union have alleged for a long time that many Tibetans, whether they're refugees who came after 1950s or who were there before, all of them somehow, unfortunately, in common parlance, are called refugees. Well, the allegation is that the refugee population, the Tibetans, have been trying to, use their connections, their economic connections, political connections to try and get false scheduled tribe certificates. It's an allegation that student groups have made. And they say that the local Monpa communities, who are mostly Buddhists, since they share many historical and cultural affiliations, and for the outsider they also look very similar as the Tibetans and have similar names, so they say that the Monpas are helping them. Now what happens here? We see that on the one hand, the state tries to institute boundaries between citizen and non-citizen, because the Monpas are citizens of India. They also can claim scheduled tribe status using their scheduled tribe certificates, and the Tibetans don't have those certificates, right? And yet when Tibetans avail of such certificates, the boundaries that the state in trying to be the legible state, in trying to create legibility, it creates these boundaries by creating these documentary processes. But when false documents are circulating, this boundary is disrupted and illegibility is created in this way. So margins are these cracks in the state processes, the loopholes in law. As anthropologist Didier Fassin shows, on the one hand, the state creates illegal immigrants by making and enforcing the laws whose infraction constitutes illegality of residence. Paradoxically, the state itself may not respect its own law and may engage in illegal practices, thus facilitating the blurring of limits between legitimate and illegitimate actions in favor of the immigrants. Customs officials and border guards who are complicit in illicit border crossings embody margins, for they work both as state agents and private or local strongmen. They are the local dadas, and thus represent this in-between space between legal and illegal, who are positioned within and outside the law. So I think there was a comment from somebody talking about how we have to be outside the margins. I think if we think about the meanings that margin can generate, then inside, outside need not necessarily, being outside of margin need not necessarily be a criteria. It can be right in between, right? These figures, such as the strongmen who use muscle power with state sanction to coerce people, the paramilitary forces engaged in narcotics trade, or the brokers on international boundary lines who might be working for customs. These are figures on the margins of law who reside both inside and outside the law, are not so much the exception as the everyday. The margins are these cracks, these interstices, these thresholds, and these edges. In urban spaces, margins appear in the informal economy, in jugaad, in the practices by street vendors, homeless people, slum dwellers who may take benefit of loopholes in the law. For example, anthropologist Nikhil Anand discusses how in a city like Mumbai, where there is unequal distribution of water, right? There is unequal distribution, water doesn't reach everybody, water might be expensive, water bills require daily payment, and that might not be possible for many people. So middlemen like plumbers function as the link between the formal and informal sectors. Economically disadvantaged groups who are not given water or cannot pay their water bills use the plumber's knowledge of the city's water infrastructure, because the plumbers know everything, all the pipes and all the keys that has to be operated to open the flow and all that. So these disadvantaged populations use the plumber's knowledge of the city's water infrastructure to acquire water connections informally. This documentary called Katiyabaz, which I can relate to because I spent some years in Kanpur, it makes a similar point of showing how in the absence of formal maintenance services in Kanpur, people can fall off the electricity grid. But again, middlemen like the Katiyabaz, who's basically a person who steals electricity by joining wires, but that person, that figure, emerges as a savior for those cities' populations surviving on the fringes by providing them access to electricity informally. The third concept of margins, which is as the spaces between bodies, law, and discipline. So we know again that it has been talked about by Foucault, and we have also found this in our own work. We can apply this to daily activities, even more so today than before. How the state rests on biopolitics or subjugation of bodies. The notion of biopolitical state shows how the management of life becomes an object of politics, right? Management of life becomes an object of politics. How the modern state shifted its gaze from managing territory to the management of bodies. The biopolitical strategies of containing populations such as refugees is an obvious example. Margins are the slippages and asymmetries between bodies and biopower. So an important insight from here is that what is applicable to the margins can become extendable and normalized for whole populations. And you can think of many examples. I'll give you one. An example is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is widely agreed that COVID-19 led to a rise in authoritarian rule across the world, for it created docile bodies. Many countries in Asia and the Middle East use the rationale of social distancing to curb social movements. We all submit to checking, surveillance, and control more than ever before. So in other words, a marginal or exceptional period in medical history has been routinized to other spheres. Margins are dangerous. Why are margins seen as dangerous? Again, there has been a lot of talk in the previous session about how we should not exoticize the margins. How can we claim to speak for the margins? But I think the effort is more to allow the margins to speak for themselves, or to allow the margins to show how power is arbitrary. Right? That is the point of an academic exercise, since, as Shilpa very rightly said, we are all academics. We are in an academic conference. If you want to become a non-academic later in life, career change, that's different. But right now, this conference shows that we are all engaged in the process of academic production, and our job is to enable, right? Not to become full-fledged prescriptive figures. So why are margins seen as dangerous? We have seen that margins are disempowered places and peoples, yet they hold possibilities of overturning power or exposing the arbitrariness of power. And we find this idea that margins are dangerous well explored in anthropologist Mary Daltrus's classic Purity and Danger, where she explored concepts of order, structure, boundaries, and margins. The human body is the ultimate bounded system. It symbolizes the structure of society. Bodily orifices represent the body's margins or vulnerable points and are considered in primitive cultures, that Mary Douglas used, but really use it within scarce. So they're considered in primitive cultures to be the source of the body's impurity. Anything that goes out should not be admitted back. The Maoris regard menstrual blood as dangerous. The quote is, "If the blood had not flowed, it would have become a person. So menstrual blood has the impossible status of a dead person that has never lived." Eerie, but it's about ambiguity. Thus, body orifices, fluids, and excrement have always involved rituals of purity and pollution. For these rituals are said to control the danger. Rituals basically express the anxiety about the body's orifices. And the sociological counterpart of this anxiety is basically the same, right? We want to protect the unity, of the boundaries of the group, of society. Anything that is threatening it, anything that is creating mobility, flows, transitions, change is regarded as a threat. So the response is to overthrow, to control that threat. So those who do not fit in are considered dangerous. Those who are moving are dangerous. Those who are in transition or in temporary state are dangerous. For transition is neither one state nor the next. And the person who is himself or themselves in danger also emanates danger to others. So by implication, being marginal is powerful. For margins pose a challenge to order, hierarchy, and rule. And again, I think a caveat is that we don't want to glorify margins. We don't want to give some kind of autonomous agency, but we're trying to see how margins can show how certain structures are basically arbitrary and random, right? Just like Zygmunt Bauman was talking about design and waste, and how waste is not intrinsic, it's not an intrinsic property. So to see the arbitrariness of all these kinds of structure. How much time do I have? Okay, even if I have time, I don't think I'll take so much time. Maybe we can have more discussion around it and your inputs too. So again, in her 2022 ethnography, Being Single in India, Sarah Lamb focuses on single or never married women who depart from the conventional path of marriage in India. Situated outside of what is considered normal, heteronormative social identity, they are able to, from that position, speak critically about society's exclusive social cultural norms. Lamb considers single women's stories as queer because they offer a compelling portrait of compulsory heterosexuality and heterosexual union and patrilineage as seen from the margins. So here single women are margins within a patriarchal and heteronormative social order. They're often seen as dangerous. In relation to the state, we have already seen how margins are the cracks in state processes, right? So how margins can be dangerous. We have seen in the case of a state, in relation to the state, the margins are these cracks, these interstices and whatnot. But this very unstable or indeterminate or fluctuating, right? It's not something, doesn't have to be something constant, but this very indeterminate character of the margins not only allows for resistance, but also breaks open the solidity often attributed to the state. The margins or cracks allow us to recognize the state as far from being an objective and neutral entity. The margins decenter the state. Anna Singh finds in margins a useful analytic tool with which to explore cultural exclusions as well as the creative potential for rearranging the social categories that peripheralize a group's existence. So basically, margins are sites from which to see the instability of social categories, including state, patriarchy, or any hegemonic discursive formation. Let me circle back to geography and to nearer home to stress this point about margins. The chars are a marginalized geography, like Orochandi Saika has written about it. He attempts an against the grain reading of colonial archives to retrieve the agency of chars. James Scott also does a subaltern retrieval of the agency of repopulation through the Zonia concept, right? He says that this book that he later published, what was it called? Against the State or something like that. But anyway, it started out as a talk which was actually titled differently. It was called Why Civilization Cannot Climb Hills. Basically, his argument is that, the people we find in the geographical peripheries like hills and all, it's not as if they are away from civilization. They consciously moved away from the civilization because the state taxes were very oppressive, and then it was a gesture of kind of resistance. So it was a political stand. Saikia does a subaltern reading of the chars, but unlike Scott, doesn't focus only on human chars as a human habitat, but in their entangled dimensions, focusing on crops, boats, and the shape-shifting and alternating presence of these geographies. Chars were dangerous for the colonial design, and I use danger in the sense that Marie-Toplas uses it, as something that is out of place and hence poses a threat. Chars are dangerous because they are first unenumerable. They cannot be counted. You cannot count them or make an inventory of chars because they keep disappearing and reappearing. Local people have a shared knowledge and shared understanding of ownership over such shifting landmass. So if one subarges, another re-emerges next to it, then somebody, the previous owner will say, okay, this is mine. So it is what James Scott called metis, insider knowledge. Metis is practical knowledge, or knowledge embedded in local experience, which is opposed to technique, which is a systematic body of formal, general, abstract knowledge, which is kind of deducible from fundamental principles. So metis represents a wide array of practical skills and acquired intelligence in responding to a constantly changing natural and human environment. So local people, local populations had metis about shores. But the shifting landmass of shores was not amenable to colonial administrative designs, which required fixed, settled entities for enumeration and taxation. And for the same reason, actually, colonial rule was hostile to other human mobile populations also, right? Mobility was always a problem for colonial. Also, the denotified tribes, which David talked about. So problems of enumeration and the intrinsic instability or mobility of shores made it difficult for colonial rule. Colonial rule actually colonial rulers prefer settled agriculture. So we needed an against the grain reading, right? A subaltern reading in order to reclaim the subject position and agency of the chores, to see them in a different light from colonial days. And through such methods, the marginality of chores can be exposed for what it is, something that did not fit into colonial patterns of governance. So there is nothing that makes anything intrinsically marginal. They become marginal because they don't fit in. And again, this is just one of the definitions or aspects of margins. Margin is a very open-ended category. So to sum up, margins may be marginal people, indigenous people, minorities, refugees, and immigrants. Margins could be remote locations like border areas or places where there is limited connectivity. Marginal are also those who inhabit the cultural, social, and economic peripheries, those who do not fit into the normal and the normative. Typically, then, margins are disempowered people and places. But field work, archival work, literary analysis by scholars like all of you who have been doing this in the last few days show that margins are not so disempowered. They hold possibilities of overturning power or exposing the arbitrariness of power. If we take margins as physical borders, it is there that we find the greatest state surveillance, because it is at the border that state territoriality is challenged through cross-border movement. Or if we take margins to be those persons standing outside of a heteronormative setup, we can find in their lives and practices possibilities for change. So what I've done is focused on ethnography at the margins in this talk, but all the studies that have come up in the last few days can hold about, studies about margins can hold a mirror to power while yielding insights about resistance and alternatives. Not to glorify margins, but to show the possibilities they have when we take a view from the margins. All right, that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guwahati. I think, in fact, following from the last session, this was actually an excellent way to tie up, not to tie up, I don't mean to close that discussion, I know that's a discussion that will go on, but to really bring together, I think, maybe what might have been a lot of disparate ideas or different kinds of questions coming together. And I thought what Dr. Guwahati did wonderfully was to draw this connection between, what most often is constantly invoked when we think of the margins, which is the disempowerment, the partial citizenship, being excluded from a full citizenship, not having all of those rights that citizenship entitles one to, and a certain kind of exclusion, disadvantage. Those are the kinds of things we think of when we invoke marginality. But to think of how those kinds of ideas or those positionalities and those spaces and identities, in fact, have so much subversive potential, and it is precisely in that exclusion that then allows those that the against the grain reading, and that allows for sort of exposing, what we were told was the arbitrariness of power. And I think that actually, was for me such a great note to end on when we think of the questions of margins, which is to precisely draw this connection from the disadvantage, disempowerment, the exclusion, to how that creates the potential for, in fact, disrupting this apparent stability that degenerates and reproduces the arbitrariness of power. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing us to this very thoughtful end of the conference. But of course, the floor is now open for discussion. So I'd like to invite whoever would like to ask a question. You can raise your hand, maybe introduce yourself, and go ahead and ask the question. So we have, I guess, about half an hour. Is that correct? Yeah? No? Well, we'll see how the discussion goes. But the floor is open, so please go ahead and raise your hands.
So, I don't know if this is working. So I think that there were some people who could not say what they wanted to say in the last session. We can continue that conversation. And it doesn't have to respond to this particular piece, because this is responding to what went before. Yes.
Mic cooler mic. On ko liwa.
I guess it's working. Yeah, good evening, ma'am. There was once a remark that was made to me that I am from the margins. I could never understand the statement then, neither do I understand it now. So my question is, where does, who creates the margin and where does it exist? Thank you.
Would you like to give some background background about why people say that you're from the margins?
I was delivering a lecture, an online lecture, and then there was a remark from the panel, and they said that I'm from the margins because I'm from Assam. Maybe, I don't know what made her say that. Maybe from Assam, and because maybe due to the topic that I was delivering on the Ahom history. So I don't know why, because I never considered myself as from the margins. I held myself up high. I don't see being marginalized by anyone or anything. But still, I think since the topic has been brought up, it lingered in my mind somewhere. So therefore, I'm raising this very question: who creates the margin and where does it exist?
There's this remark from Professor Saikia just before this session that margins are relational, relative. And I think somebody from Arunachal Pradesh would not see Assamese as marginal. Somebody from Delhi or Punjab would see Assam as marginal from a geographical point of view because it is nearer the edges of the territorial India, political geography of India, and also culturally and in terms of material infrastructure, there might be some sense or perception of marginality of a particular kind in relation to Assam. But that same sense would not be held by somebody from Arunachal Pradesh. So I think it is also very relational. And in this case, it is pretty clear that it's all these different parameters of geography, cultural, belonging, which have brought about that remark, I think. And I'm sure other people also want to respond. Since we are carrying on this conversation from the previous session, why do you think Assam is marginal? Anybody wants to respond to that?
Ma'am, may I intervene here?
Yeah, yes.
So ma'am, based on it, can we argue that the margins exist in our own minds?
Right. That is true. I mean, there is something like borders of the mind, margins of the mind. Margins can also exist in one's mind.
So if
Not always, yes.
Yeah, so if it is created in the mind, then if we alter our thoughts, then we can also alter the way we behave and the way we think. So the margins won't exist at all in that way. I don't know if I'm correct.
That is a very hopeful comment, and again I come back to what Pastor Prad said about thinking with equality in the final comment in the session.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor Guwahati, for that really thought-provoking presentation, and also shedding light on the concept of margin, by taking that kind of like its conceptual arguments and its implication on how we think about inequality, margins, peripheries, and so on and so forth. So kind of coming back to that idea of conceptions, and of course we know there are also trends, so-called in quotes trends within the academic discourse, particularly in the global north. Another term that became quite common in usage was also frontiers. So if you could shed some light on at what context would frontiers be, would make certain conversations possible, and in what context would, say, a concept like margins be helpful? Although I do agree with you that margins does allow us to have a more, think about and think through and engage with a lot more broader concepts, like margin within, for instance, I come from a tribal community in Arunachal Pradesh, right? So from the center, we are the peripheral in different ways, but within the community, of course, there are gender relations, class relations, so there, of course, there's variegated sort of margins. So that is one. I mean, I know it's a, like how do you kind of address that question of frontiers, although frontier has a military sort of a historical background, but how now many scholars are also kind of like delving into how to broaden that, and I think some of, there are also some stand that is kind of careful in broad conceptions which are too broad and capacious, that it's so broad that it could be anything and nothing at the same time. So, I mean, these are just some questions. Other thing from the previous commentator, I mean, like if I could have a conversation about our margins and our thoughts, and I wish it was completely on our thoughts. I went to the university and I thought I was not that bad a student, but I was immediately told during my admissions with the person who was doing the admissions, who was a professor in the college, that I should reconsider my stream, because without looking at my papers, she assumed that it would be very difficult to cope with something as tough as English honors and so on and so forth. So, I mean, sometimes you encounter margins, perhaps imagined, or a lot of times not. And sometimes you're like compelled to encounter them unwillingly.
So I think getting your question, second question, response to your first question. Especially one characteristic of your first question, one aspect of your first question is that sometimes what is the value of using words that can proliferate into so many different directions meaning-wise, and is there any value, theoretical, conceptual value, where something like margins is so polyvalent in that sense? And your experience that you encountered, where you encountered a margin, shows us that in some cases certain concepts become more useful, and margins may be more useful to describe an experience than frontiers. Because frontiers, as you yourself mentioned, we have to talk about your research, and I didn't get time to discuss this, but I think it will be very interesting to find out what your current research is on, whether you're working on frontiers. Because frontiers, like you said, has a military history. It started with the American expansion of American experience of expansion into this wild, West, and so frontier was a concept that applied to certain things which are, in flux. It's flexible. It can be further expanded, and so the idea of frontier as something expandable has therefore been also co-opted into words like frontiers of knowledge or frontiers of civilization, because it's about how much you can push the boundaries, how much you can push the frontiers. So it has that kind of connotation, and in some respects it does come in very handy, but not in all cases. So I think in some cases margins would be more fruitful to use, but the reason I also want to think about the concept of margin is that whether it is margin, whether it is caste, whether it is development, whether it is any word, we have to address it, right, before we talk about it. Before we go into the empirical part of or illustration part of it, whether it is through textual analysis, whether it is through ethnographic work, whether it is through archival work, we have to address the concept. So what do we mean by margin? I think such conferences bring people together and also allow a lot of dialogue to happen, both in the panel sessions and outside the panel sessions. But often, and they don't maybe allow you enough time to expound on the concept of it, which you might have been doing alongside all the while. But this is an important part of any kind of academic work, that we have to address the concept before launching into it. We cannot take these concepts for granted. So what do you want to do with this concept of margin? How do you want to use it? It can mean many things, right? Do you want to use it as a border, as a physical border, and then why don't you use border? And that's why your question is so important. If I want to do a work and I want to use margin instead of frontier, when I'm working in a frontier, why do I think I want to privilege or use the word margin and not frontier? So what is the conceptual advantage of this, or how do I draw on literature before me? How do I allow my findings to dialogue with literature already existing, or data? How do I let the data speak to me in such a way that margin appears more fruitful in my work than frontier? So these are questions we have to address, and that is something that your question actually brings out to.
Hello. Sorry. In the second iteration of the conceptions, I think you did touch on the complicit nature of the state in the management and production of margins. And I just wanted to ask if you have consistently been looking at the criminality of the state and how there's a certain way in which the state acts as a criminal in a way in the management and production of marginality, and how do you look at that in your works? Because it has certain implications for subjects such as anthropology of the state and how people relate with the state and legitimacy of the state for these kinds of people. So yeah, so just curious, how do you deal with that question?
Two responses. Labeling the state as criminal is not what I as an academic would do. It's not academic language. So two responses. One, again I will draw on ethnographic works. Didier Fassan, who is an anthropologist, he says that we have to study the state as constituted by its human actors. And human actors are not infallible. I mean, they are subject to emotions, they are biased, they are governed by a lot of, affective effects. So subjectivity comes into the picture. So when we think about this state as an objective state, it's untrue, right? The state is not an objective state. It is not an objective entity because it is completely, sometimes, it is dependent on these human actors and people who execute what is the state. That's one thing. The second thing is again by an anthropologist called Akhil Gupta, who talked about poverty. Right? Why, despite so many, Garibi Hatao, so many poverty eradication programs in India and also other places, but in India, it continues. Right? One argument by the development studies scholars have been saying that it's basically to perpetuate state rule. It's a deliberate design so that state can keep on controlling people, marginalized populations, that's one. But the other argument which Akhil Gupta has given is that it's the nature of bureaucracy. The whole process of, for example, asking people who deserve a pension, asking them to come, fill out application forms, this pro forma, this whole formatting application. First of all, people don't understand the language of bureaucracy. They're not literate in the language of bureaucracy. And sometimes the way bureaucracy works, the bureaucrats themselves are very interested in meeting targets. Right? We have to give 50, we have to finish 50 files, we have to clear 50 files by the end of this month, and we have to report to our hierarchs. And we need to meet that target. So in that particular, urgency, bureaucrats are sometimes not able to, even if they want to, they're not able to give attention to these details which are important in resolving poverty. So it's nature of bureaucracy. So whatever, however you want to take it, I don't think one can, dismiss right away a state as criminal state without doing ethnography or empirical studies. I think whatever you say, you have to be basing it on some substance and some evidence. So I don't know if I'm referring to a particular case. If it's a particular case, then of course the answer will be different. But right now I'm not answering in terms of particular cases, I'm answering generally about the state.
Hello. In relation to the question you raised about the state, so Partha Chatterjee talks about this concept called political society, where he talks about in the 20th century, with the popular politics rising up, there are margins like the ones Madam just focused on, like people living on the margins, the Jahangirpuri. So how these societies, these people also differently from the civil society, which is elite-based sort of concepts as we understand organizations, these also create their own sort of politics and negotiate with the state. So here state comes in negotiation with these kind of margins, the people and the cells which are organized cells. So here these become not just the borderlines but, as ma'am said, interstices, the gaps which are also negotiating with the power that we. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Anybody else wants to respond? Because you can take it, like I said, as a furthering of the previous conversation. Anybody wants to also talk about concepts and of the margin? The concept of margin?
Hello. Yeah. Really nice lecture, ma'am. My background is in philosophy. So when we deal with these concepts, like the case studies and the things that you talked about, I cannot much relate to it, but I can relate it to it in another way, and I'd like to talk about it. I'm working in feminist epistemology. So when we do that, I studied this decolonial philosophical idea of thinking from the borders. You know, people like Walter Knowles and all of those people have talked about thinking from the borders or border knowledge, which feminists have later also called knowledge from below. So borders, below, and then here we talk about margins. So I just wanted to ask you firstly, how do you think this border, if it is different from how you see margin, or if it is not? And the second part of my question would be, when I talked about borders in my research, I tried to show how there is a difference in the concepts of borders as understood in other societies or communities where these epistemic ideas actually come about, and in India, right? The borders here are different as understood as what is understood in other cultures. Now, these ideas of border, are they, in Indian context, are they escapable or are they leavable? Can someone evade these borders? So that's all.
I would again say that your second part has answered your question. Why? Because this is the point I am trying to make, that theories, especially for an anthropologist, theory is not something that hangs just above you like a cloud. It is grounded. So it emerges from the material that we work with, whether it is philosophical text, whether it is about India, or whether it is ethnographic empirical work or archival matter. So the theory must emerge from that material, the data itself. And in that, how do you think any concept, whether it is border or margin or frontier, how does it compare with how it has been dealt with globally or in some other part of the world, and how it shows itself to you? So that is important. That is where you can make your theoretical innovation. Or you can say that this is where my understanding of the border is nuanced in this particular way. You have to let your data speak to you, your material speak to you. So I say that I am a border studies scholar. But I know that border has been treated in so many different ways. Metaphorical borders, borders of the mind, geographical borders. And the geographical borders also have all these other borders, right? Which one do I want to talk about? Maybe in particular one article, one paper, I want to talk about the geographical border more, which I have done. In some other cases, I want to talk about this, ethnic boundaries and ethnic borders, where people are talking about these blurred boundaries between Tibetans and Monpa communities. So in each case, the border will be different. But I think my task as an academic has to be to elucidate the particular meaning that I'm working with. So if you feel that the feminist border from below is a concept that works, it works for you. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but you have to show why it doesn't work. So it's research, and it's a thought exercise, I think. And you want me to talk about borders? I was at Hyderabad University recently, and I gave a talk about the difficulty of studying borders. Borders can mean so many different things. I don't want to rehash that talk again, another 30 minutes. But what I just want to say that borders, frontiers, all have been treated differently. People say that, well, frontiers mean these flexible lines, flexible zones, borders mean these inflexible lines, boundaries mean maybe lines, plus cultural and symbolic boundaries, like Frederick Barth, somebody's anthropologist, said it, and margins can mean all these things. But what does your data tell you?
So we're more or less out of time, but if there are any questions at the end that anyone would like to ask. So if there isn't, then I'd like to once again thank Dr. Mohai for joining us, for also being the
I tried to sit in some of the sessions and I enjoyed all of them. I could not be there in all the sessions because, like one paper I don't have these ghosts. Another paper was very interesting paper. So no ghosts to replicate me, the original. But I wish you all the best in your writing up. And if you have not done field work, then in your field work, in your archival work, and contextual work. Thank you so much to Dr. Jairat again and to everybody here.
Thank you once again, ma'am, for your elucidating address. Now I would request our research scholars, Shilpa and Abhilasha, to come and felicitate our esteemed guests.
Thank you, Varsha, and Pranamika, and Shilpa, and I don't know who else is in the Upasana. Yes, everybody in the team.
At the end, I call upon the student candidate Pranamika to deliver the vote of thanks.
What is it? Atanya.
I stand before you, filled with gratitude and immense pleasure as I extend my heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you who graced us with your presence at the 9th Graduate Research Meet. It is indeed an honor to be standing here representing the organizing committee to express our deepest appreciation for the immense support and enthusiasm you have shown throughout this event. First and foremost, I would like to express our profound gratitude to our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. G. N. Devi. Sir, your insightful words not only enlightened us, but also ignited our minds, encouraging us to think beyond boundaries. I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to everyone who contributed to the success of our valedictory session. To our respected dignitary, Dr. Sociology Guwahati. Ma'am, your presence added immense value to our event, and we are deeply honored to have you here with us. I would like to acknowledge the support and cooperation we receive from our sponsors, ICSSR and ONGC. Your generosity and belief in our vision played a pivotal role in making this event possible. We are genuinely thankful for your support. A special word of appreciation goes to our dedicated organizing committee members and volunteers. I begin by thanking the student co-convener of this event, Varsha, including the other organizing committee members, Upasna, Shilpa, Priyanka, Shivam, Divyanshu, Tushar, Soham, Suresh, Abhinasha, Anjali, Ripapika, and Ananda. I am also thankful to my colleagues Tanaya, Ajmal, Hemant, Sonia, Kuria, Judy, Amitesh, and Ishan. And a special thank you to Sri Rashmi for agreeing to quickly and happily design a GRM bag. And to our volunteers, Robert, Shubham, Rajeshri, Rohini, Kesar Rupjyoti, Nabanita Om, Deepshikha Barnani, Prayag Tunkar, Mohammed Nabu, Sudarshan Morpana, Arka Navnath, Anaswara, Samya, Mishti Gaurav, Sayandeep Satyam, Lian, Kesilio, Mahesh, Siddharth, Nayantara, Ashwati, Aditya, Chelsea, Umesh, Thomas, and Amarji. All of your tireless efforts, commitment, and creativity were the driving force behind the smooth execution of this event. It is your hard work and determination that made this event a success that I am truly grateful of. I would like to extend my gratitude to the HSS office staff, Durgada, Rubinda, Nandeshwar sir, for their constant support and encouragement. We, the HSS students, are able to smoothly carry our work because of your constant guidance. To our enthusiastic audience, your participation and engagement have been truly inspiring. Your presence here today signifies a commitment to learning and growth, and we hope that the knowledge and experiences shared during this event will leave a lasting impact on our lives and endeavors. Last but not the least, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our faculty convener, Dr. Vasudha Jalal, and the head of the department, Dr. Pranku Sharma, whose guidance and encouragement paved the way for us. I am also very thankful to the chairpersons, as your expertise and insights have constantly challenged our perspective in these 2 days and have inspired us to think differently. As we wrap up this event, let us carry forward the lessons learned, the connections made, and the inspirations gained. Together, we can continue to create positive change and contribute meaningfully to our respective fields. Thank you once again for being a part of this incredible journey. Your presence has made this event truly memorable, and we look forward to meeting you again in the future endeavors. Thank you and have a wonderful evening. I would like to request everyone to please move gradually for high tea in the lobby. Thank you.